Why are weak squares critical for chess middle game strategy? Imagine a battlefield where certain spots are more vulnerable than others. In chess, those spots are called weak squares, and they can decide the outcome of the game. A weak square is one that cannot be defended or controlled by a pawn. These squares are like open doors for your opponent's pieces to invade deep into your position. When you see a weak square, it's not just an empty spot. It's a potential stronghold for enemy pieces. In the middle game, controlling or exploiting these squares can give you a big advantage. The way pawns move and exchange shapes the weak squares on the board. When a pawn moves forward or is captured, it leaves behind a square that no longer has pawn protection. Since pawns cannot go backward, these squares stay weak unless you control them with your pieces. For example, if a pawn pushes forward and leaves a square behind it unprotected, that square becomes a target. Opponents love to place knights, bishops, or rooks on these weak spots because they can control many key areas from there. A knight sitting on a weak square can influence the entire board, limiting your options and forcing you to respond. Weak squares near the center or close to your king are especially dangerous. If your opponent can place a piece on a central weak square, they can gain control of the middle of the board. This makes it easier for them to attack your king or set up tactical threats. Weak squares near your king can also be entry points for enemy pieces, increasing the risk of checkmate or losing material. Creating weak squares in your opponent's position is a common strategy. By provoking pawn moves that leave behind weak squares, you can then occupy those squares with your own pieces. For example, placing a knight on an opponent's weak square can restrict their pawn breaks and limit their piece activity. Once you control a weak square, it becomes a staging ground for attacks or a safe haven for your pieces. Controlling weak squares also opens up tactical opportunities. You can set up forks, pins, or discovered attacks by placing your pieces on these vulnerable spots. Having a piece on a weak square often forces your opponent into passive positions, giving you the chance to push for material gain or improve your overall position. In practical terms, watch how pawns move during the game. Avoid creating weak squares in your own camp by advancing pawns carefully. At the same time, identify your opponent's weak squares early on. Maneuver your pieces to occupy or threaten those squares. Use weak squares as launching pads for attacks on their king or other critical points. Combining control of weak squares with open lines and coordinated pieces can really put pressure on your opponent. In the end, weak squares are like hidden vulnerabilities in a fortress. Recognizing and exploiting them can turn the tide of a game. Managing these squares well is a key part of strategic planning and piece placement during the middle game.